The Nanda dynasty was a formidable power in Magadha prior to the Mauryas. They came to power by supplanting the Sisunaga dynasty. Unfortunately, no contemporary source talks about this dynasty. So, we have to rely on basically the Puranas and some Jaina sources, which gives us some information about the whereabouts of this dynasty. Some of the information comes from the Greek sources, particularly the historians of Alexander, who writes about the king who lived in the region of the Ganga valley. But all the sources, whatever little we have, are unanimous on one point. The Jain Parishishta Parvana talks about the Nanda, the first Nanda ruler, The Buddhist sources, however, though talks about the low social origin of the Nandas, says that the Nandas did not come to power either by any connivance or by killing any ruler, but it was an open struggle between the last rulers. If you look at a much later text, for example, the Harshacharit of Banabhatta, there also we find that it talks about the low social status of the Nandas, and it is said that Mahapadmananda came to power after killing Kakavarna, the ruler of the Sisunaga dynasty. Thus, in general, the whole idea of the Nandas coming into power is given the form of a group of rulers who belongs to a very low social origin, and therefore, if you look at from a historical point of view, that the Nandas who actually killed the Kshatriyas and who built their empire on the Kshatriya kingdom is very important, because in history we do not find such examples where a person of a low social origin comes to power and then becomes the ruler of a vast empire like Magadha after terminating all the Kshatriyas. So, therefore, he has also been compared to Parashurama, who was known as the killer of the Kshatriyas. Now, the first Nanda ruler, we know that his name was Mahapadmananda, and Mahapadmananda's another name given in the Puranas was Mahapadmapati. He is also known as Ugrasena. When he came to power, or when he became powerful, he was assisted by Jaina ministers. The Jain sources talk a lot about the ministers who were assisting Mahapadmananda, and we find that in the beginning there was a minister whose name was Kalpaka, who did not want to assume charge, but later on when he became the minister of Mahapadmananda, he forced him or inspired him to go on an expansionist policy. Jain sources also mention that the ministerial posts were hereditary. This we learn from the fact that it is said that when one of the ministers died, then his son Sthulaka was asked to become the minister, but he refused and went to become a monk, and then his brother Shrenyaka became the minister. So, thus these are the information which are not very explicit, they are implicit information hidden in the records, and from there we have to find out how the Nandas governed their territory. Now, coming to Mahapadmananda, we find that if we look at the history, the Puranas give us a very checkered history, because it talks about 100 years of Nanda rule, which is not very plausible. But on the other hand, the Buddhist story talks about 22 years of the Nanda rule, and if we go by then, which is quite plausible. So, if we go by the Buddhist tradition, we find that perhaps the first ruler, that is Mahapadmananda, occupied the throne around 344 BCE, considering the fact that Chandragupta Maurya ascended the Maurya throne around 322 BC. So, from 344 to 322 BC, we have the Nanda rule in Magadha. There are variations in stories between the Jain tradition, the Buddhist tradition, and of course, the Puranic tradition. The Puranic tradition talks about 9 Nanda rulers. This is supported also by the Buddhist tradition and the Jain tradition. But so therefore, this kind of confusion remains when we have very little data regarding a certain dynasty. So, the conception or the perception of an Ekarat actually germinated during this time, and when the Puranas give us that why he is an Ekarat, because he was ruling a vast region from the Himalayas to the Godavari. And this we will understand when we locate the territories which, as given in the Puranas, which were defeated by or brought under the annexations policy of Mahapadmananda. So, we will discuss this one by one. The dynasties that were uprooted, because we have to remember that these were all Kshatriya dynasties, and it is very Puranas are very categorical when they talk about the Kshatriya dynasties. It says that the dynasties that were actually defeated by Mahapadmananda were the Ikshvakus, Panchalas, Kashis, Hoihayas, Kolingas, Asmakas, Kurus, Maithilas, Shurosenas and Vithihotras. Now, if we remember, these all were important Janapadas during the time of the 16 Mahajanapadas. And we know that the entire story, that how from the 16 Mahajanapadas gradually 4 Janapadas became important, and finally Magadha began to rule the roost as a very important power. Now, a look at the territory of the Janapadas or the areas which were defeated by Mahapadmananda would show that this was the core territory of the Ganga valley. Some were located in western India. Western India was actually very important, particularly the Malwa region, which acted as a corridor, and then some were of course located further south along the Godavari river. Now, the Ikshvakus are associated with Koshala, that we all know. Even we know that Rama belonged to the Ikshvaku family. So, Koshala became a part of the territory of Mahapadmananda. Then we have 2 groups which are always taken in the or talked about in the same breath, the Kurus and the Panchalas. Kuru Panchala region actually referred to the Kurukshetra and Berili region or Ahichatra region, which was the ancient Ahichatra and the domain of the Panchalas in UP. Now, Maithila, if we look at Maithila, this is not Bihar, and we know that during the time of the Janapadas, we did not have reference to Maithila as a Janapada, but gradually the eastern part of the country, the Pracha Desha, was gaining importance, and Mathila region or the Maithili region, that region was having a character of its own. So, North Bihar gives you an access to the Vaishali region, it gives you an access to the foothill of the Himalayas, and therefore, it was important to conquer this area. The Shurosenas obviously refer to the Shorosenai of Megasthenes or the Sorosenai, which is referred to in Greek literature, and it is related to Mathura region. Mathura being at the crossroads of different area of the northwest India, which was connecting northwest India to the Ganga valley, was a very important hub during this time, and it continued to be so for a later period also. It was on the river Jamuna. Next to Mathura, we have the territory of the Hoihayas. Now, the Hoihayas had their territory, had the capital in Mahishmati, which is present day Mandhata or Maheshwar region, which is also very important. So, control of Malwa was important for Mahapadmananda as a power. The Vidhihotras are closely related to the Hoyhoyas and Avanti region, and the Ashmakas were actually ruling in the Godavari region. So, from the Himalayas till the Godavari region, the entire area was within the Nanda domain. Now, if we look a little later and go back to the territory of the Mauryas, we find that Western India was a very strong stronghold of the Mauryas, particularly the Girnar region in Gujarat, where we have the famous Junagarh rock inscription, and there we know that Vaisya Pusyagupta was the governor of the Mauryan ruler Chandragupta Maurya. Later on we have the rock edicts of Ashoka also in that region. So, perhaps the Mauryan empire was built on the foundations of the Nanda empire, which were ruling in this region during this period. Now, after looking all these Puranic places, which we find that the statement are very clear in the Puranas about the empire, but there are certain independent evidence also which suggests that these regions were within the territory of the Nandas. For example, let us take the case of the Hathigumpha inscription of Kharavela, the ruler of Kalinga. So, in the Hathigumpha inscription, line 5, we find that Kharavela states that a canal which has been dug out by the Nandas, he was bringing this canal from Tanasulia town to the capital. So, the whole idea that the Nandas had come to Orissa and a canal was being excavated by them gives you the understanding that Orissa or Kalinga formed a part of their territory. There is another territory or a city known as Navnandadhera in the Godavari, which has been also been taken to be as a part of the Nanda empire. So, these independent evidences and the reference in the Kathasharita Shagara that there was a camp of the Nandas in Koshala or Ayodhya. So, all this prove the fact that the Puranic perception or the Puranic statement that the Nandas exterminated the Kshatriya kings of these regions become very evident and plausible. So, when we think of the Chakravarti Kshetra of the Puranas, we find that this kind of ideals was actually present in the literary genre of the period, where a Chakravarti Raja had to conquer the regions from the north to the south or from the Himachal to the sea. So, that is the conquest of the territory which was known as Digvijaya. As I have mentioned earlier also, that we have paucity of sources regarding the history of the Nanda dynasty. Now, in between we do not know the name or anything, any event of any ruler of the Nandas. We immediately from the writings of the classical authors, we come across a name which is known as Agrams or Zandrams, who has been identified by the historians as Dhanananda, whose name is found in the Puranas. Now, the very name Dhanananda suggests that it is related to wealth, and this love for wealth of the Nanda dynasty is quite proverbial, that we find referred to in all kinds of literature which talks about the Nandas. Now, the Greek accounts are very important for understanding the history of Zandrams and Agrams. What we find is that it is said when Alexander was planning to move further east, then the historians learnt that there were two nations, one was Prasioi and the other was Gangaridoi, and which were under one single authority, and these were the Nandas. Now, regarding the identification of Prasioi, it is very easy because Prasioi can be from the word Pracho, which means east. So, eastern part of Alexander's region was known as Prasioi, and Gangaridai relates to the Gangetic delta. Now, the problem is how to locate exactly the regions of Gangaridai and Prasioi. The realm located to the east of the Jhelum in the Gangetic country with its capital at Palibotra. Palibotra can be easily identified with Pataliputra, and surely it was the capital of the Magadhan realm. The Greek authors also impress upon us about the huge army of the ruler of Presioi and Gangaridai. And what is interesting is that they have information regarding the low origin of these rulers. So, the whole idea about the humble origin of the rulers and that these rulers were detested by the common people, were not liked by the common people, is also found from the writings of the Greek authors. Dhanananda was despised because of his wickedness and his disposition of wealth. His love for wealth was well known. So, we can understand that the figures can be inflated, but how much? And the fact that they were having a huge army perhaps instigated Alexander to go to the east, and this acted against the fact that his army men were not interested to fight any more wars, and perhaps they were not interested to go to fight a war with such a huge army. And therefore, recent scholarship has tried to argue that perhaps the reason why this overstatement of the largeness of the Magadhan army, or why the Greek authors were giving the amount of army or the cavalry, the horsemen, the chariots that the ruler of Magadha was in possession, was the fact that they were trying to justify that these kind of huge army led the warriors of Alexander's forces not to go and fight anymore because they were already very tired. Now, if we look at the consolidation of the Nanda dynasty, we find that one of the very important factor which led to the consolidation was their knowledge about the extraction of resources and handling of revenue matters. The Nandas methodically collected taxes and were appointed officials as a part of this tax collecting missions, and therefore, in the Greek sources we have references to administrative officers. So, if we compare the Nanda dynasty's administrative position with the Mauryas, we find that perhaps this kind of administrative division which the Mauryas actually founded and which the Mauryas was used during the time of Mauryan administration had germinated during the time of the Nandas. We have to remember that the first imperial structure based on a very strong agrarian milieu was built up by the Nanda dynasty, and on this factor actually the later dynasties of early India built upon their own dynastic lineages. The next very important point about the Nandas, we find that the addiction of Dhanananda to wealth, which is depicted not only in the Greek sources, but also in the Buddhist sources too. We have a very interesting anecdote which is preserved in the Kathasharita Sagara, and it is said that his wealth, that is Dhanananda's wealth, computed at 990 millions of gold pieces. And the Buddhist version says that the youngest brother was called Dhanananda from his addiction to hold treasure. So, and we have information that a huge rock was excavated, and below this rock actually Dhanananda kept all hidden all his treasures and golds and other things. So, how did they get all these treasures? So, naturally it was a policy of extortion, and we have certain kinds of indications where the Nandas were levying taxes on all kinds of objects. For example, taxes were levied on skins, on stones, on trees, and all kinds of material from where one could have taxes. Even a Tamil poem refers to the wealth of the Nandas. It is says that the Nandas were very victorious in war, and who, having accumulated a lot of treasure, was using this treasure for warfare also. And the Tamil poem tells us that this treasure was hid beneath the water in the Pataliputra region. So, this is very interesting, that the idea of amassing wealth, which was the forte of the Nandas and which has been recorded in Buddhistic tradition, in Jain tradition and the Puranic tradition, has also its impact in the Tamil tradition far south, which gives us an idea of how proverbial the wealth of the Nandas were. The tradition of the fabulous wealth of the Nandas reached even the Chinese traveller in 7th century CE, Xuanzang, who talks about the 5 stupas of Pataliputra as representation of the 5 wealth resort or wealth hoard of the Nandas. Thus, the wealth of the Nandas became proverbial in this even in the later times. Now, regarding the administration of the Nandas, we find that the Greek authors gives us certain idea, and certain ideas are taken from the Jain sources. But if we look at what the Greek authors are going to tell us, we find that Justin gives us a very accurate statement that the internal administration was very good, and where actually he was talking of the region contiguous to the Jhelum, and the king was quite respected there. But on the other hand, we know that in the core territory, the king was very exploitative, and the regions of Kurus, Panchalas and other places were actually very much under the strong control of the Nanda ruler. So, this suggests that the Nandas followed two kinds of policies. For the core region, they had the policy of extortion, where they was quite extortionist, and for the peripheral region, they had a liberal policy where the internal administration was quite good. And this reminds us of a famous anecdote that which comes from different traditions, that one has to, if you look at the Nanda Empire, or if you want to control the Nanda Empire, then you have to start from the periphery, from the borders. And we know that this is an though this is an anecdote, that Chandragupta Maurya actually did this. He started from the periphery and then he entered into the core region of the Nanda territory. When the people were oppressed by the Nandas, so naturally it paved the way for the rise of a new leader. And from Plutarch and Justin, we know that the oppressed people of the Nanda dynasty found a new leader in Chandragupta Maurya. So, and when Chandragupta Maurya met Alexander, he showed keen interest in the affairs of Prasyoi. So, the glamour of the Nandas was overshadowed by the splendor of the Mauryan dynasty, and if we have to believe Brihat Katha, of course, the Brihat Katha gives us a different angle of the Nanda dynasty. It talks about Pataliputra under the Nandas, which became the abode of Lakshmi and Swaraswati, and in social matters, the rise of the Nandas actually ushered in a completely new concept, where we have the ruling house from a very low social origin. Thus, Romila Thapar says that the Nanda attempt was cut short by Chandragupta Maurya, the young adventurer who usurped the Nanda throne in 322 BC. It was under the Mauryas, therefore, that the imperial idea found expression.